In the mid-17th century, Spain was, on paper, the most formidable power on Earth. Its empire stretched from the sun-scorched plains of Mexico and Peru to the rich trading ports of the Netherlands and Italy, an empire on which the sun never set. Its armies, the famed tercios, were the most feared infantry in Europe, and its royal family, the Habsburgs, were the most influential dynasty on the continent, a sprawling web of kings and emperors who had dominated politics for centuries. The Spanish court in Madrid was the center of this universe, a place of rigid ceremony and immense wealth, presided over by a king, Philip IV, who was so famously stoic that it was said he had only laughed 3 times in his public life. This was a dynasty that defined itself by power, piety, and above all, purity of blood. But when Philip IV's long-awaited male heir Charles was born, it was clear that something was desperately wrong. He was crowned at 4, yet didn't take his first steps until 8. His tongue was so swollen, courtiers had to chew his food and nudge it down his throat like mother birds. Neighbors and rival courts swore Satan himself had touched the throne of Spain. But the curse on Charles II wasn't black magic. It was a family tree twisted so tightly it looked like a spider's web. Stick around, and I'll show you how Europe's most powerful dynasty inbred itself into collapse. To understand the tragedy of Charles II, you have to understand the Habsburgs' core obsession: keeping power in the family. For centuries, their motto could have been, "Let others wage wars. You, fortunate Austria, marry." They mastered the art of strategic alliances, marrying their children into the royal houses of Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, and Hungary. This policy turned them into the dominant force in Europe, uniting vast and wealthy territories under a single name. But this success created a new problem: how to keep this immense inheritance from being divided or lost to rival families. Their solution was to turn their marriage strategy inward. They simply refused to marry outsiders. For 200 years, the Spanish Habsburgs repeatedly married close relatives, believing they were preserving the purity of their line and consolidating their power. Uncle-niece unions became disturbingly common. First cousin marriages were routine. The family tree began to fold in on itself. Instead of branching out, it became a closed loop. Of the 11 marriages that occurred in the Spanish Habsburg line over nearly 200 years, 9 were consanguineous, meaning between blood relatives. Geneticists today can quantify the result of this. They use a figure called an inbreeding coefficient, which measures the probability that a person will inherit 2 identical copies of a gene from a single ancestor. For the average person, this number is 0. For the child of first cousins, it's 0.0625. For a child of a brother and sister, it would be 0.25. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was calculated at 0.254. He was more inbred than the child of an incestuous union because his parents' marriage, uncle and niece, was just the final step in generations of intermarriage. His family tree has fewer unique ancestors than most people have in just a few generations. The result of this genetic collapse was a body that barely worked and a mind that never fully woke up. He was the living embodiment of a dynasty's fatal flaw. Born on November 6, 1661, Charles was a source of both hope and horror from day one. Spain needed an heir, but the infant was profoundly sick. He was the tragic culmination of a family trait that had been getting progressively worse: the infamous Habsburg jaw. For generations, family portraits had documented a jutting lower jaw, a large tongue, and a bulbous lower lip. In Charles, This was so extreme he could not chew his own food or close his mouth properly, causing him to drool constantly. His developmental delays were terrifying for a court that depended on a functioning monarch. He did not speak his first words until he was 4 years old and couldn't walk until he was nearly 8. He suffered from seizures, fevers, and digestive problems so severe they left him racked with diarrhea and vomiting. He was still wetting his bed well into his teenage years. Court diaries and ambassadorial reports are filled with shocking descriptions. One observer called him so ugly as to cause fear. His head was enormous, out of proportion with his frail body, and his jaw jutted out so far it was a caricature. To the deeply superstitious 17th century palace, this collection of maladies couldn't be natural. The deformity, the seizures, the constant illness, it had to be the result of a curse, of witchcraft. They called him Carlos el Hechizado, Charles the Bewitched. Modern doctors, however, see a textbook case of genetic collapse. The severe underbite is known as mandibular prognathism. Researchers speculate he suffered from at least 2 rare genetic disorders: combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his short stature, weak muscles, and infertility, and distal renal tubular acidosis, a kidney disorder that can cause a large head and other skeletal issues. The curse wasn't from a spell. It was written in his genes. Because Charles was a child king, and a profoundly disabled one, he couldn't rule. The power of the vast Spanish Empire fell into the hands of his mother, Mariana of Austria. This created an immediate political crisis because his mother was also his aunt, a living symbol of the Austrian Habsburg connection that many in Spain had come to resent. Queen Mariana's regency was tumultuous. She was an intelligent and determined woman, but she was politically isolated. She leaned heavily on a small circle of trusted advisors, most notably a German Jesuit priest named Johann Eberhard Nithard, and later, a dashing but opportunistic courtier named Fernando de Valenzuela. This reliance on foreign-born favorites infuriated the proud Spanish grandees, the high-ranking nobles who saw themselves as the rightful counselors to the throne. Soon, the court split into warring factions. At the center of the opposition was Charles's own illegitimate half-brother, Don Juan José of Austria, a popular and ambitious military hero. He positioned himself as the champion of Spanish interests against the Austrian faction led by the Queen Mother. The palace became a snake pit of intrigue, with nobles, clergy, and foreign ambassadors constantly plotting and counterplotting. While the court bickered, the empire crumbled. Decades of expensive wars had drained the treasury. The steady flow of silver from the Americas was shrinking. In 1668, Spain was forced to formally recognize the independence of Portugal, a territory it had controlled for 60 years. The once invincible Spanish army suffered humiliating defeats, and the king? Charles was a pawn in these games. He was taught to read and write, but his cognitive difficulties made it nearly impossible for him to comprehend the complex affairs of state. His primary activity was hunting, but even then, his physical frailty was apparent. He often had to be strapped to the saddle to keep from falling off.
By his late teens, the most pressing issue in Spain was the king's marriage. An heir was needed to secure the dynasty and provide stability. At the age of 17, Charles was married to the beautiful French princess, Marie-Louise d'Orléans, the niece of King Louis XIV. The hope was that this injection of fresh, non-Habsburg blood would finally break the supposed curse and produce a healthy successor. Marie-Louise arrived at the Spanish court to great fanfare, but her life quickly turned into a nightmare. The vibrant and fashionable French court was a world away from the suffocatingly rigid and pious atmosphere of Madrid. She was lonely and isolated. trapped in a loveless and ultimately fruitless marriage. Charles was reportedly infatuated with her, but the marriage was never consummated. His physical and possibly psychological impairments made it impossible. After each failed and awkward attempt, Charles would often weep, blaming the evil spell he believed was placed on his body. As the years passed with no news of a pregnancy, the political pressure mounted. Marie-Louise, once hopeful, slipped into a deep depression. She reportedly developed an eating disorder and spent her days in despair. Then, in 1689, after a decade of marriage, she fell violently ill after a horse ride. She died within a day, at the age of just 26. Instantly, rumors of poison swept the court and the country. The finger of blame pointed directly at the Austrian faction, who feared that a French queen and a potential half-French heir would pull Spain away from its traditional Habsburg allies and into the orbit of its rival, France. Though the official autopsy diagnosed acute gastroenteritis, a plausible cause of sudden death, the story of a beautiful, tragic queen poisoned by scheming courtiers was too dramatic to fade. Courts and history love villains, and the whisper of poison has clung to her memory ever since.
Devastated by Marie-Louise's death and increasingly desperate about his own condition, Charles turned from medicine to the supernatural. If he was the bewitched, then surely what he needed was not a doctor, but an exorcist. Spain descended into a bizarre and dark spectacle as the king sought a spiritual cure for his genetic afflictions. He embraced extreme forms of piety, wearing a coarse hair shirt against his skin, a form of penance so severe that it left him with scars. In the royal chapel, barefoot friars would whip themselves in front of the court, hoping their mortification would appease God and lift the curse from the king. The palace, already a deeply religious place, became a theater of frantic superstition. The most famous and politically charged of these episodes involved a series of formal exorcisms. A prominent friar, Fray Froilan Diaz, was brought in to lead the charge. The exorcism rituals became a political weapon. During the sessions, demons were said to have spoken through the king, naming high-ranking figures, especially those allied with the German Queen Maria Anna, as the source of the witchcraft. The exorcisms devolved into a full-blown political inquisition, targeting enemies of the faction that had promoted the exorcist. Perhaps the strangest of all his attempts at a cure was a small leather pouch he wore around his neck for the rest of his life. Inside was a grotesque collection of relics intended to absorb the evil spell. Human toenail clippings, strands of hair, and even a dried, desiccated frog. To modern eyes, it is a sad testament to a man driven to desperate measures by a lifetime of suffering. Historians see a tormented individual trying to find some sense of control over a body that had always betrayed him. His contemporaries, however, saw a king who truly believed he was locked in a personal battle with the devil. In 1690, a year after Marie-Louise's death, the court arranged a second marriage for the 28-year-old king. The bride was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a large and famously fertile Bavarian family. Her family had many children, and the hope was that her robust lineage would succeed where the French connection had failed. But the result was the same. The marriage was once again childless. The political factions in the court, which had temporarily united in their grief over Marie-Louise's death, resumed their vicious infighting, now centered on the new German queen. Maria Anna was a formidable and politically savvy woman. Realizing that her husband was incapable of producing an heir, she began actively scheming to ensure the Spanish throne would pass to her preferred successor, her nephew, Archduke Charles of Austria. Court doctors who examined the king during this time noted discreetly that his genitals were infantile and malformed, confirming the physical impossibility of him fathering a child. While Charles continued his spiritual battles, Maria Anna asserted her influence over the government. She consoled herself with enormous quantities of chocolate and endless games of cards, all while the Spanish treasury ran dry and the great powers of Europe began to circle. They were like vultures, waiting for the last Spanish Habsburg to finally die so they could carve up his vast empire. By the turn of the century, at the age of 38, Charles II was a complete invalid. His body was finally shutting down after a lifetime of struggle. He could no longer digest solid food. Painful ulcers covered his legs, and the stench from the infections became so overpowering that courtiers had to carry pomanders stuffed with orange rind and spices just to be in his presence. Epileptic seizures rattled his frail body almost daily. His mind, never strong, began to fade entirely. He experienced hallucinations and violent fits. Yet, even on his deathbed, he was the most important man in Europe. The question of who would inherit his empire, Spain, the Americas, Italy, the Netherlands, was the only thing that mattered. The two main claimants were Philip of Anjou, the grandson of the powerful King Louis XIV of France, and Archduke Charles of Austria, the candidate favored by Queen Maria Anna and the Holy Roman Emperor. The French and Austrian ambassadors, along with their allies in the Spanish court, waged a relentless political war around the dying king. Queen Maria Anna tried to bully him into naming the Austrian Archduke, but a powerful pro-French faction, led by Cardinal Portocarrero, the Archbishop of Toledo, worked to convince Charles that only France was strong enough to hold the empire together after his death. They argued that naming the Austrian candidate would lead to the dismemberment of Spanish territories. On October 27, 1700, barely conscious, Charles performed his last act as king. He signed a will that had been prepared for him by Cardinal Portocarrero, naming the French candidate, Philip of Anjou, as his sole heir. 5 days later, on November 1, 1700, Charles II of Spain died. He was 38 years old. The official autopsy report is a horrifying final testament to his genetic inheritance. The physicians recorded that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrefied and gangrenous, and he had only a single blackened testicle. One of the doctors present was said to have muttered, "The king has died, though he stopped breathing long ago." Charles's death did not bring peace. In fact, his will, intended to preserve the Spanish Empire, instead lit the fuse on one of the largest European conflicts of the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession. The moment Louis XIV of France accepted the Spanish crown on behalf of his grandson, Philip of Anjou, the rest of Europe mobilized. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire formed a grand alliance to oppose what they saw as an unacceptable consolidation of power by France. They backed the claim of the Austrian candidate, Archduke Charles, who insisted he was the rightful King Charles III of Spain. The war lasted for 12 brutal years. The fighting stretched from the fields of Flanders and Germany to the waters of the Mediterranean and the colonies in the New World. Great generals like the Duke of Marlborough for the Alliance and the Duke of Villars for France led massive armies in bloody battles that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. When the carnage finally ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the map of Europe had been redrawn. Philip of Anjou was allowed to remain King of Spain, becoming Philip V, but on the strict condition that the crowns of France and Spain would never be united. In exchange for this recognition, Spain was forced to give up its European possessions. The Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia were ceded to Austria, while the strategic island of Sicily went to Savoy. Most galling for Spain, the fortress of Gibraltar and the island of Minorca were handed over to Great Britain. The Spanish Habsburgs were officially extinct. A French Bourbon now sat on the Spanish throne. The dynasty that had obsessed over keeping its blood pure had ultimately polluted itself out of existence.
Enjoying these history detours? Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss the next strange but true tale. It's easy to dismiss the story of Charles II as a bizarre piece of historical trivia, a macabre tale of royal incest and its grotesque consequences. But his life is more than that. It's a cautionary billboard about the dangers of clinging to ideology in the face of overwhelming evidence. The Habsburgs prized the political ideology of dynastic purity and the symbolism of keeping the crown in the family above all else. They continued this practice even as the biological facts became painfully obvious in their own children. They saw the deformities, the infant mortality, the sickness, but chose to interpret it as a spiritual problem rather than a physical one. The result was a disabled man who lived a life of constant, daily suffering, and a continent that bled in a massive war for over a decade after his death. In an age where we debate gene editing, the responsibilities of hereditary power, and the conflict between tradition and scientific reality, the story of the bewitched king feels less like ancient history and more like a dark mirror.
So the curse on Charles II was real, only it wasn't a spell whispered by a witch. It was spelled DNA. Centuries of obsessive inbreeding turned a mighty royal line into a genetic closed loop, and that loop tightened until it finally strangled the last tragic heir. The Spanish throne survived, but the Spanish Habsburgs did not. The empire they had built through strategic marriages was ultimately broken apart by the consequences of those same marriages turned inward. Next time someone tells you history is dull, remember the king who couldn't chew, the queen who died of a broken heart, the court that turned to exorcists for a genetic problem, and an entire empire that gambled its future on the fragile, malformed life of one man. What do you think? Was Charles cursed, or just cursed by his DNA? Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.